Well, hello. This is my mini lecture for Chapter 3, which is on the values and ethics in organizational development. You're going to find this particular mini lecture really mini in the sense that it actually only has 4 slides total. So this will be a very short lecture, but I think an important one in the sense that we talk about the values and ethics in organizational development. In my last lecture on the history of organizational development, one of the things that I pointed out was that when you look at the values and you look at the practices of organizational development today, you will see all of the elements of the history that we talked about still with us today. And I think you'll see that here immediately as we sort of process through the various values that an organizational development practitioner essentially comes to adopt as they take on this perspective. Okay? So let's begin with some of the values, assumptions, and beliefs of organizational development. The first one is the idea of participation. As you saw very early on with the T-group work of Kurt Lewin, is all the way up to the very notion of employee engagement. The idea of getting employees involved, hopefully at every level of the process, becomes important. Also, it suggests a leadership style that values the participation of employees, not just at some peripheral level, but hopefully truly seeking opportunities for people to get involved into the heart and soul of the work that takes place at the organization. By the way, let me note that for the purpose of simplicity, I've tried to fit all of these particular values on one page, so please forgive the crowdedness of this slide, but hopefully you'll appreciate the fact that you can kind of see them all as a gestalt. Okay. The second value, once again, is the idea of groups and teams. The value of teams, and once again, hopefully you can see how that has been a constant theme across all the movements. Getting teams to work. Teams have tremendous impact, and perhaps when we get to talking about team interventions, I'll get a chance to kind of talk a little bit more about the value of a team, say, over an individual. But for now, let it be noted that groups have the advantage of being what are called multicephalous organisms, and that just simply is a fancy way of saying that they have many brains. You have many more people to think things through. It doesn't mean that groups are always more effective than individuals. In fact, there are times in which groups can actually be a hindrance. But for the most part, if groups and teams are managed well, they will typically outperform an individual every time. And so one of the values of an OD practitioner is to find ways to allow teams to flourish in the organization, hopefully by learning strategies and tools that help for the facilitation of teams. One very big value is the idea of growth, development, and learning. In one sense, the assumption is that people, groups, and organizations are always in process of learning. As you recall, in lots of the movements was there a focus on learning. Within the concept of organizational learning specifically, right, was a definitely big attention to the learning process. This next bullet point, capacity building. If you recall from my mini lecture on defining organizational development, this was something that I added to your textbook. And that is that it's very important that we understand the importance of capacity building. An organizational development specialist essentially seeks to work themselves out of a job with the idea that hopefully the client takes on the ability to be able to deal with that issue themselves as they go into the future. Now, it may take the client a while to actually develop those capacities, so it may not be as soon as maybe the second or third issue that comes up, but hopefully over time the client develops the ability to really develop themselves. And so in that sense, it's not just growth and development from any particular implementation, but it's also growth and development in their own capacity to be able to deal with organizational development or organizational change challenges in the future. The whole person. OD focuses on the whole person in the sense that we try not to see people as just simply mere instances of their job descriptions. Just because a person is in the accounting department does not necessarily mean that they have no contributions to make to operations or to the HR function. In fact, that person who is in the HR function may have a lot to say to the folks over in marketing or in research and development. And so an OD value is to see how you can't allow for people to get all aspects of them involved. Essentially, the assumption is that when you are allowing people to express more than just one dimension of themselves, you're going to get greater buy-in, greater engagement, greater involvement of those people into organization functions. Dialogue and collaboration. Right along with the idea of using groups and teams in participation, if you're going to get participation, you're going to have to create ways in which people can have dialogue, both at the individual as well as at the collective level. And so the idea of creating cooperative rather than competitive systems of collaboration becomes very important. Traditional hierarchy in which only one person does all the talking and the other people just sort of take their marching orders from that one person is something that needs to be viewed as obsolete or pushed into obsolescence if you're going to have sincere dialogue and collaboration. And looking for win-win solutions. This is in contrast to the idea of conflictual or competitive systems in that case. The idea that everybody can win, it doesn't have to be either employees versus management that oftentimes has been so typical of the way that people have characterized their relationships between management and employees. And then authenticity, openness, and trust. Very important aspect of any kind of healthy collaboration that's to take place, whether you're talking about vertical relationships or even horizontal relationships in the organization. And so an OD practitioner is always looking for ways in which true authenticity, openness, and trust can be built and developed in an organization. So these important values must become a part of any kind of organizational development process in order to make that process effective. In many ways, you can kind of think of this as sort of the oil that becomes important to lubricate the engine of the system. Obviously, without oil, any engine is going to break down. It's going to burn up, in fact. And so without these core values, any kind of change process is likely to also falter. Let's talk about some of the challenges to these OD values. Oftentimes, people who come out of school have been ingrained with these values. In that sense, they're very idealistic about what they can go and accomplish, and oftentimes are hit very early on with what people would consider to be practical concerns that oftentimes make it hard for one to implement these OD values. So let's talk about some of these challenges. One would be financial tensions. Early in one's career, particularly if you are a full-time OD practitioner, oftentimes there's the feeling that you can't afford to say no and walk away from an opportunity if the people are not in agreement with some of these values. Say an organization workplace that does not want to bring all people to the table and get their opinions. They just simply want you as the practitioner to, take your plays from the boss and go forth and do the work. Consulting is oftentimes referred to as a feast or famine enterprise. So you're needing to eat. So can you truly afford to walk away if people aren't willing to come into agreement with OD values? So that would be a very real challenge there. Another real issue is the view of organizational development as technology. Oftentimes there is a need to resist the temptation to see OD as nothing more than as a set of tools and techniques. And oftentimes you end up selling OD techniques rather than associating the values that are important to have with them. Okay. The third challenge to this is the idea of management culture and expectations. Oftentimes management does not see a value to anything that doesn't spin off immediate bottom line results. And so oftentimes the desire for financial and economic results can in fact run contrary to the kind of implementations that are going to lead to better human results. And as you can see, OD values are very much weighted in favor of human practices. So oftentimes the culture that tends to be associated with management and expectations that managers have to show immediate bottom line results can run contrary to these values. Fourth principle that can oftentimes be very contrary to organization values can be the idea of research. Usually in research, when you're trying to assess the effectiveness of something, you usually don't assess the effectiveness of a philosophy, which is really more of what the OD values are, as much as you try to assess the effectiveness of a particular technique or implementation. So much like this idea of viewing OD as nothing more than technology, research oftentimes, if it's focused too much on the OD techniques and methods that practitioners use, rather than on the approach or the perspective of OD, right, then OD once again gets reduced to nothing more than the tools and the strategies that OD practitioners use, which when in fact it's really more than that, right? It's a perspective and not just a mere collection of tools. So, I mean, these four things are things that any OD practitioner is going to have to, take some time and carefully think through, how they're going to deal with them. The first one, admittedly, is a biggie. If you're full-time employed in OD, and definitely if you're starting out and you don't yet have your machinery going, oftentimes you really simply don't feel as though you can afford to say no. And so in those cases, you might really look for a form of compromise. I have a colleague of mine that's famous for a number of quotations about OD work, and one of the things he says is that you got to learn how to dance with the guy or girl that brung you. His way of what he means by that is that oftentimes you're looking for a compromise. A person brings you in and they have certain expectations, and maybe what you're willing to do is sort of give a little bit, but in hopes of ultimately influencing that person more toward the OD approach of things. So you in fact might begin with some of these things, maybe with just taking your marching orders, but through the process you might be able to convince that manager to really see the value in bringing people to the table, in the sense of helping them to see how without those people at the table, right, this particular implementation is doomed to fail. Right, and so in that case, you might begin with more of their perspective, but as you walk through the process, the work itself will oftentimes show the necessity for many of the values that have been adopted within the OD world. Okay. So now I'd like to turn to my last topic, which is ethics. This is going to be the shortest of them all, but I simply want to suggest that ethics are important because they provide the guidelines for implementing the values. And so essentially you can think of ethics as sort of the action steps for values. Values are abstract. and they're good in the sense that they're global, but you're never going to know how to implement those values until you move to the concept of ethics. Ethics become those sort of right or wrong guidelines for how you implement those out. I think that it would behoove every practitioner to really think through their own personal ethics, especially when you think about the challenges that I just discussed. But also, in your book, there's a very healthy appendix, and it lists some established OD ethics that have been developed and agreed upon through a number of organizational development societies. And so I would simply direct your attention toward that appendix. You definitely should take some time and peruse those ethics. You'll see that they cover everything from the importance of confidentiality, the importance of not overselling your skills in terms of what you can do, the importance of how you handle data, guaranteeing people anonymity or confidentiality. Those become very important kind of considerations in that case there. And these are the kind of things that you want to be aware of, because in the point at which you begin to enter an organization and begin to develop a contract with that organization, it's very important to make managers aware of where there might be some important ethical guidelines. I guarantee you, inasmuch as you underestimate the importance of having this ethical conversation at the beginning, you will definitely at some point run up against it. In all of the organization development projects that I've been involved with now for some nearly 20 years, I can tell you that there are almost always ethical issues that pop up in virtually every project that I've worked with. And so you can never really underestimate the importance of thinking through carefully the ethical considerations. Okay, so that ends my mini lecture on values and ethics for Chapter 3. Take care.